a forbidden love, a life marked by despair, and choices that should never have been made. What happened will leave you speechless. The romance between a respected priest and a young undocumented immigrant seemed like a chance for redemption, but it ended in tragedy, shattering lives and shaking an entire town. Have you ever felt the weight of decisions that seem to have no way out? In this story, we reveal how secrets and crossed boundaries led to the point of no return, and what this lesson can teach us about love, faith, and the dangers of ignoring our own pain. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, as I'll be sharing a series of videos about crimes involving women. These videos will help you recognize behavioral patterns and situations that could save your life and the lives of your loved ones. Shape the silence of Alburquerque. Alburquerque was one of those towns that seemed straight out of an old book, with cobblestone streets echoing the stories of generations. Perched on a hill in Spain, the town was surrounded by green fields and distant mountains, painting a scene seemingly untouched by time. Alburquerque had just over 2,000 residents, all living at a slow, harmonious pace, as if the modern world outside was in no rush to arrive. At the heart of this small community stood the Church of Santa Ines, an imposing stone structure dominating the main square. With its tall tower and a bell that rang faithfully 3 times a day, the church was the beating heart of Alburquerque. For many, it was more than a place of worship. It was a meeting point where lives intertwined and secrets were safely kept under its stone arches. Can you imagine the secrets hidden in a town like Alburquerque? Or even in your own community? Often, danger is closer than we think, and recognizing the signs can be the key to staying safe. That's why I've pinned a comment with a book titled How to Identify a Potential Psychopath in Your Daily Life. Signs you must never ignore. Copies are running out quickly. Make sure to get yours before it's too late, and be prepared to face dangers that often go unnoticed. Leading the community with serene determination was Father Mato Alvarez. At 42 years old, Mato was the model of virtue admired by the townsfolk. He seemed to carry the weight of every confession, every prayer, with a dignity that inspired respect. Always dressed in his immaculate cassock, he had a presence that could make even the most skeptical drop to their knees in prayer. But Mato had something that set him apart from others. Although his life seemed perfectly aligned with the principles he preached, there was a loneliness in his eyes. At night, when the town sank into an almost absolute silence, he stayed in his modest parish house, reading by lamplight, as if trying to fill a void that no prayer or sermon could seem to reach. Few knew how isolated he felt. After all, Mato was the one everyone turned to in times of need, but who could he turn to? Losing his mother in his youth, and the absence of a family of his own left him with an emptiness he masked with dedication to his priesthood. He filled his days caring for the needy, organizing community events, and mentoring the town's youth. But at night, when Alburquerque's silence grew even denser, he faced his own demons. Despite his loneliness, Mato never showed weakness. He smiled at the children running through the square, listened patiently to the elderly's worries, and regularly visited the sick. It was as if he was always trying to prove to himself and others that faith was enough to fill any void. However, Alburquerque harbored a secret. Something dark lay buried beneath the town's calm surface, waiting to come to light. And Father Mato, with all the respect and trust he had earned, was about to become a central piece in a puzzle no one in town knew was being assembled. This was the silence of Alburquerque, not the silence of tranquility, but the unsettling silence of something on the verge of being revealed. And when the first piece of the mystery began to move, life in Alburquerque would never be the same again. The fate of Lucia Morales. Lucia Morales arrived in Alburquerque on a cold November night with little more than a battered suitcase and a heart full of uncertainty. At 26, she had left her hometown in Colombia, driven by the promise of a job that never materialized. Like many who cross borders in search of a better life, Lucia carried dreams too big for her reality, along with a constant fear that seemed to grow with each passing day. In Alburquerque, Lucia was almost invisible. She blended into the quiet backdrop of the town, walking the streets with her head down and speaking little, always afraid of drawing attention. Without documentation, her life was a constant struggle for survival. She worked wherever she could, cleaning houses, washing dishes in a small local cafe, and sometimes taking on heavier tasks in the surrounding areas, such as seasonal harvests in the fields. The money she earned barely covered the rent for her tiny room on the outskirts of town, but she saved every penny to send part of it to her ailing mother back in Colombia. Before we continue, let me briefly remind you to grab your copy of the book pinned in the first comment. The book, How to Identify a Potential Psychopath in Your Daily Life, Signs You Must Never Ignore, can help you protect yourself and your loved ones. Get yours before it's too late. Despite her hardships, Lucia maintained a calm demeanor. She was the kind of person who smiled sweetly, even when her eyes told a different story. She was generous, always willing to help others, even if it meant sacrificing more of the little she had. This kindness did not go unnoticed. Some people in town sympathized with her, like Doña Carmen, the elderly woman Lucia cared for in exchange for warm meals and some emotional comfort. What truly set Lucia apart, however, was her resilience. Despite the constant fear of deportation, she never stopped working hard or dreaming of a better future. At night, after long days of labor, she would often stop by the church of Santa Ines. She wasn't a practicing Catholic, but she found in the church a sanctuary, a place where the world seemed less cruel for a few minutes. She would sit silently on the wooden pews, admiring the stained glass windows that reflected the soft glow of candlelight. For those brief moments, she felt like she could breathe without fear. Father Mato Alvarez noticed her but respected her silence. He understood that many souls sought the church not just for faith, but for a place to feel safe. He tried to help her discreetly, offering occasional work at the church, like cleaning the stained glass or organizing the pews. She thanked him with a shy smile, but never accepted charity. "I prefer to earn my way," she would say with a firmness that impressed Mato. However, Lucia's vulnerability also made her an easy target. Some people in Alburquerque didn't view immigrants favorably, believing they brought trouble to the town. Whispered comments in bars and markets often put Lucia in uncomfortable situations. She pretended not to hear, but with every murmur, she felt the weight of being a stranger in a land that didn't want her. Everything seemed precariously balanced on a fragile line, until Lucia disappeared. No one noticed right away. After all, she lived on the outskirts, interacted little, and was used to being invisible. But when Doña Carmen waited in vain for her to come to dinner on Friday and found her room empty on Saturday, something began to feel wrong. In the small town where everyone knew everyone, the silence surrounding Lucia's disappearance screamed louder than any words. Lucia's fate was about to become the starting point of a mystery that would shake Alburquerque to its core. The first contact. Lucia Morales had developed a habit of stopping by the church of Santa Ines at the end of her workdays. What began as a simple search for moments of peace soon turned into a routine. There was something about the atmosphere of that place that made her feel protected, as if the stone walls held not just ancient stories, but also the whispers of comfort she so desperately needed. The church was especially beautiful in the late afternoon. The golden sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant colors across the wooden pews and the altar. Lucia always chose a discreet corner, far from curious eyes. For her, being there wasn't just about faith, it was an attempt to find refuge for her weary soul. Father Mato Alvarez noticed her presence from the very first time. She wasn't like the other worshippers, who came as part of their religious routine. There was something different about Lucia. Maybe it was the restless glances she cast at the door every few minutes, as if ready to flee at any moment. Or perhaps it was the way she seemed to open up a little more with each visit, as if gathering the courage for something. It was during a quiet afternoon, when the church was nearly empty, that Lucia finally decided to approach him. She walked hesitantly toward the confessional, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the door. On the other side, Mato adjusted his posture, sensing the tension in the air. "Father, may I speak with you?" Lucia's voice was low, almost a whisper. "Of course, my child. I'm here to listen," Mato replied with his usual calm. Lucia hesitated, as if each word she was about to say was a barrier hard to overcome. But then, in a sudden rush, she began to speak. She talked about her journey from Colombia to Albuquerque, about the low-paying jobs that kept her in constant exhaustion, and about the paralyzing fear of deportation. There was pain in her words, but also a strength that impressed Mato. He listened intently, not interrupting, allowing her to pour out her heart. I don't know what to do anymore. Lucia concluded, her voice breaking. It feels like I'm always running from something. I never have peace. Mato took a deep breath before responding. Sometimes the burdens we carry are too heavy to bear alone. But you don't have to carry this alone, Lucia. This place, these walls, are for anyone seeking refuge, no matter who they are or where they come from. Those words were like a balm for Lucia. For the first time in a long while, she felt that someone truly saw her, not just as an undocumented immigrant or an invisible worker, but as a person. In that moment, an emotional connection was born between them. Mato became more than a spiritual leader. He became a safe harbor amid the storm of Lucia's life. From that day on, their conversations in the confessional became more frequent. Lucia began to open up more, sharing her hopes and fears, while Mato offered advice and prayers. He knew he couldn't solve all her problems, but he was determined to do whatever he could to ease the weight she carried. What neither of them knew was that this connection, so charged with humanity, would end up entangling them in something much greater. Something that would force them to confront not only their own demons, but also the darkest secrets of Albuquerque. And what if you were in Lucia's or Father Mato's place? Would you risk everything for such an intense connection, even knowing the dangers it could bring? Hearing the weight of each person's decision makes us question, how far would you go for someone who brought light into your darkness? Leave your comment and share your thoughts. Your perspective could reveal new angles to this intense story. And who knows, it might even help anticipate the risks this relationship was about to face. The evolution of their bond. After that first confession, something changed in the relationship between Father Mato Alvarez and Lucia Morales. What began as a simple moment of spiritual support grew into something deeper, something neither of them could immediately name. Lucia began visiting the church more frequently, not only to pray, but also to help with small tasks. Mato conveniently found excuses to delegate, polishing candlesticks, organizing hymn books, cleaning the pews. These tasks became ways to keep her around. Mato's gestures, initially discreet, started to draw the attention of the few who noticed the young Colombian woman. He would discreetly gift her bags of groceries or leave a small sum of money in an envelope under the guise of community assistance. He always acted cautiously, almost as if fearing others might misinterpret his charity. For Lucia, these acts were more than just help. They were proof that someone finally cared about her. "You don't have to do this, Father," Lucia would say with a shy smile. "I can manage." "I do this for myself too," Mato would reply, his voice carrying a sincerity that left Lucia speechless. He justified his actions as part of his mission, but deep down, he was beginning to realize his motivation went beyond duty. As time went on, their encounters became more personal. Mato made a point of listening to Lucia, not just as a confidant, but as someone genuinely interested in the woman behind the hardships. He asked about her life in Colombia, the mother she supported from afar, her dreams, and her fears. With every answer, he felt he wasn't just learning Lucia's story, but also witnessing the unshakable strength she carried. Lucia, in turn, began to see Mato differently. The respect she felt for him as a priest gave way to admiration for his humanity. He wasn't just the man in the cassock, he was someone who made her feel seen and valued, something she had rarely experienced since leaving her homeland. Their bond evolved naturally, but it also carried a tension that neither wanted to acknowledge. Mato, in particular, felt the weight of his feelings growing stronger each day. He spent nights in prayer, asking for discernment, trying to convince himself that what he felt was purely platonic, a reflection of his concern for a soul in need. But when Lucia entered the church, bringing with her that shy smile and a presence that brightened even the darkest corners, Mato knew something inside him was changing. He began finding excuses to see her outside the church. He would stop by Doña Carmen's house to check on how Lucia was managing her work, or show up at the cafe where she washed dishes under the pretense of greeting the community. Lucia, always grateful for his kindness, remained unaware of the internal battle Mato was fighting. At this moment, let me remind you to grab the book pinned in the first comment and protect yourself and your family from unnoticed dangers that often leave no way back. As the two grew closer, the people of Albuquerque began to notice. Small comments began to circulate, always whispered, as is typical in small towns. Father Mato seems awfully close to that young immigrant, some would say, but no one dared speak openly, fearing to tarnish the untouchable reputation of the priest. Despite his calm demeanor, Mato was increasingly torn. He wondered how far this could go before crossing an invisible line that could never be undone. And Lucia, though grateful for his kindness, began to notice something in Mato's eyes that made her question his intentions. The bond they had built was strong, but it was starting to carry a dangerous complexity. Without realizing it, their relationship was shifting from a simple exchange of support to something with the potential to shake not just their lives, but also the delicate balance of Albuquerque. The forbidden romance. It was a winter night in Albuquerque, when the cobblestone streets seemed even quieter and the cold wind cut like blades. The church of Santa Ines was empty, lit only by the flickering light of the candles on the altar. Lucia had just finished a long day of work, and as always, sought refuge in the place that had become so familiar to her. She found Mato near the altar, adjusting a candlestick. He looked tired, but his face lit up when he saw her. "You should be resting, Lucia," he said with a smile as he put away the tools. "It's late." "I needed a moment of peace," she replied, approaching him. Here is the only place I feel safe." Mato watched her as she sat in one of the front pews. There was something different about that night. Maybe it was the absolute silence or the way the candlelight highlighted Lucia's face, showing a mix of exhaustion and determination. He sat beside her, leaving a slight gap between them, but the silence they shared felt more intimate than any conversation. "Lucia," he began hesitantly. "You know you can always count on me, don't you?" She turned to him, their eyes meeting. "I know, Father. You've been the only person who truly listens to me, who truly cares." What happened next felt inevitable. Mato reached out to touch her hand, a gesture that, until that moment, had always been full of careful, paternal affection. But this time, instead of quickly pulling away, both allowed the touch to linger. The warmth of that contact seemed to break the invisible barriers that had kept their feelings contained until then. "Mato," Lucia whispered, her voice thick with emotion, using his name without the title for the first time. "I shouldn't," he murmured almost inaudibly, but he didn't withdraw his hand. "This isn't right." Yet no words of reproach or guilt were spoken. Instead, the innocent gesture evolved into a moment charged with meaning. Mato leaned in slightly, and Lucia did the same. It was as if the weight of the world disappeared in that instant, leaving only the two of them and the comforting silence of the church. The kiss was brief, hesitant, but filled with suppressed emotions. When they pulled apart, they remained silent, both acutely aware of the line they had crossed. Mato looked away, wrestling with the whirlwind of thoughts consuming him. Lucia, for her part, seemed torn between guilt and the joy of finally allowing her feelings to surface. "Mato, Lucia began, but he interrupted her, holding her hand more firmly. "Don't say anything, please. I need to think." He stood abruptly and began pacing near the altar, running his hands through his hair as he tried to organize his thoughts. Mato knew what this meant. He knew the vows he had taken as a priest were at risk, that his position in the community could be destroyed if anyone found out. But above all, he knew he could no longer deny what he felt for Lucia. From that night on, their relationship took a new and dangerous turn. They began meeting in secret, far from the curious eyes of Albuquerque. The priest justified their encounters as acts of compassion, a way to offer support to Lucia in her difficult situation. But deep down, he knew it was no longer about compassion. It was something much greater, something he had never felt before. Lucia, for her part, was conflicted. On one hand, she understood the risk Mato was taking by getting involved with her. On the other hand, it was the first time someone had made her feel so intensely loved and valued. They were like two worlds colliding, trying to find balance in a situation that seemed destined for disaster. The tension grew with each meeting. Mato began missing minor parish commitments, something that did not go unnoticed by some parishioners. Lucia, meanwhile, tried to maintain her discreet routine, but the fear of being discovered followed her like a shadow. Every glance, every whispered word between them seemed to carry the weight of a secret they both knew was unsustainable. While the romance blossomed in secret, Mato found himself in an ever-deepening internal conflict. His prayers, once focused on guiding his community, turned into desperate pleas for clarity. He questioned whether he could continue as a priest, whether he was betraying not only his faith, but also the people who trusted him. What had started as a bond of empathy and compassion had evolved into something forbidden and overwhelming. And deep down, both knew they were treading on a dangerous line, one that was on the verge of breaking. What they couldn't foresee was how their secret romance would become the epicenter of a mystery that would forever change Alburquerque. The decline of public image. To the community of Alburquerque, Father Mato Alvarez had always been a pillar of stability and virtue. He was the kind of spiritual leader who knew every parishioner by name, made a point of visiting the sick, and was always available to counsel those seeking guidance. But over time, subtle changes began to emerge. Mato, once known for his energy and constant presence, started to appear distracted. During Mass, his homilies, once eloquent and inspiring, became short and mechanical, as if he were merely fulfilling a duty. He often drifted into thought, staring into the distance while the congregation waited for words that didn't come. It was as if the father everyone knew was slowly fading away. The first to notice were the most devout parishioners. Doña Carmen, who never missed a service, commented to her friends at the market, "Father Mato seems tired. Did you see him yesterday? He even forgot to bless the holy water at the start of the celebration." Others began to agree, and soon the quiet murmurs turned into more open conversations. "He's acting strange," one person would say. "Do you think he's sick?" another speculated. "Or maybe he's going through some kind of crisis of faith," a third suggested. These rumors quickly spread through the streets of Alburquerque. In such a small town, where everyone's lives were deeply intertwined, any change in behavior was bound to draw attention. But what few realized was that Mato's unrest had nothing to do with a conventional crisis of faith. The truth was that he was being consumed by an internal conflict. Every night as the town fell asleep, Mato knelt before the altar in a silent struggle between his vows and his feelings for Lucia. He begged for forgiveness, clarity, and strength to resist the temptations that now dominated his thoughts. Yet, at the same time, he found excuses to keep seeing Lucia, justifying the emotions that overwhelmed him. These feelings began to affect not only his conduct at the church, but also his interactions with others. He started avoiding long conversations with parishioners, fearing they might sense his vulnerability. His gestures grew more hurried, his visits to the sick less frequent. Even those he had previously attended to with patience noticed his change. "Father, are you feeling well?" asked Doña Rosa, one of the church's longest-standing attendees. "Yes, I'm fine, Doña Rosa. Just many thoughts lately," he replied, forcing a smile that convinced no one. Meanwhile, Lucia was also starting to feel the weight of the secret they shared. She noticed the growing tension in Mato, but didn't know how to help him. Whenever she suggested they distance themselves, he interrupted, insisting that they could handle it together. But the reality was that both were trapped in a web of emotions and responsibilities that seemed to tighten with each passing day. The rumors continued to grow. Some speculated that Mato was overwhelmed by the responsibilities of the church. Others suggested he was hiding a personal issue. No one dared confront him directly, but a sense of mistrust began to hang over Santa Ines. In such a devout community where the priest was seen as a symbol of morality, any misstep was magnified. Even so, Mato tried to keep up appearances. He continued celebrating Mass, offering counsel in the confessional, but those who paid attention could see something was wrong. His gaze seemed heavier, as if carrying an invisible burden, and his hands, which once moved with confidence during rituals, now trembled slightly, betraying the weight of his inner turmoil. As the community speculated, one question lingered in the air. What was happening to Father Mato? And though no one knew the answer, everyone felt that something dark was approaching, like a storm about to break the silence of Albuquerque. If this story makes you reflect on the silent struggles many face, leave a like. By doing so, you help spread this powerful message to others who may also be carrying invisible burdens. Together, we can foster empathy and reflection about difficult choices and their consequences. Be part of this movement. Every like is a light on this path. The escalation of demands. As months passed, the relationship between Lucia and Mato began to change. What had once been an emotional refuge for both of them turned into a relationship fraught with tensions and expectations. Lucia, who initially saw Mato as a spiritual support and a figure of protection, began to realize just how far he was willing to go for her. And in her vulnerable situation, she started to ask for more. "I can't keep living like this, Mato," she said one evening as they sat in the small office of the church, far from prying eyes. "Every day is a risk. Every time I leave the house, I'm afraid of being arrested, of being sent back to Colombia." Mato listened in silence, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his chest. He knew Lucia wasn't wrong. Her undocumented status put her in constant danger, and he was one of the few people in Albuquerque who understood the extent of her struggle. "I understand, Lucia," he replied, his voice low and weary. "But what you're asking, it's not that simple." What Lucia was asking for was something Mato had never imagined he'd have to consider: consistent financial support and assistance in obtaining forged legal documents that would allow her to live in peace. She wasn't doing it out of malice or manipulation, but out of desperation. Her life in Albuquerque was a tightrope walk, and the only thing providing her with any stability was her bond with Mato. But for her, that was no longer enough. "You know people who can help me, Mato. I know you do. Please, do this for me," she pleaded, holding his hand firmly. Mato averted his eyes, unable to meet her gaze. He knew that, with his connections in the church and community, he could find someone to provide the solution she sought. But the idea of crossing that line went against everything he believed in. His vow of honesty, his dedication to his faith, everything was at stake. "Lucia, you know that everything I do is for you," he said, trying to control the mix of guilt and affection that filled his voice. "But forging documents, that's a sin. It's illegal." "And what do you think living like this is, Mato?" she interrupted, her voice charged with emotion. "Do you think it's fair for me to spend every day in fear, hiding, while the people around me live freely? I just want a chance to be someone, to have a dignified life. Is that too much to ask?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mato knew she was right. Lucia wasn't asking for luxury or privilege, just the chance to exist without fear. But at the same time, he felt that each of her demands was pushing him closer to an abyss from which he might never escape. Lucia's requests didn't stop there. Beyond the documents, she began pressuring him for more consistent financial help. The little she earned from her jobs barely covered the basics, and Mato, with access to church funds, became her only hope. He started diverting small amounts, telling himself it was for a just cause that God would understand. But every note he handed Lucia seemed to weigh more heavily than the last. The relationship, once marked by moments of comfort and understanding, had become a constant source of tension. Mato felt increasingly pressured, trying to balance his role as a priest with the intense feelings he had for Lucia. And she, in turn, began to see the fragility of their dynamic. As much as she loved Mato, her survival came first, and she could no longer wait for him to quietly solve everything. The tension between them grew, and their once relieving meetings began to feel more like emotional battles. Mato found himself increasingly isolated, hiding his actions from the congregation and wrestling with the guilt consuming him. Lucia, on the other hand, began to realize that even with all of Mato's help, her future remained uncertain. Meanwhile, rumors in Albuquerque continued to spread. Mato's behavior, already questioned by the faithful, began to raise more serious suspicions. And without either of them realizing it, every demand and every concession brought them closer to a point of no return. What had seemed like a story of forbidden love was turning into something far darker, and the consequences of their actions would soon come to light. Mato's decision. The decision came on a solitary night when the silence of Albuquerque felt heavier than ever. Mato Alvarez knelt at the altar of Santa Ines Church, his trembling hands clasped in prayer. The candles around him cast restless shadows on the walls, mirroring the turmoil within him. He had spent weeks wrestling with his feelings, trying to find a solution that wouldn't lead to ruin, but the answer grew clearer and more painful with each passing moment. Lucia. Her name echoed in his mind like a persistent whisper. The love he felt for her was real, but it was also a burden that crushed his soul. Mato could no longer ignore what it meant for his faith, his vows, and his standing in the community. The relationship that had started with empathy and care now threatened to destroy everything he had built. He remained in that position for hours, pleading with God for guidance, for a strength he couldn't find within himself. When he finally rose, there was a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant breaking his own heart. The following night, Mato asked Lucia to meet him in the church garden, a secluded spot they often used for their most private conversations. The air was cold, and the stars shone brightly in the dark sky, but no natural beauty could ease the weight of what was about to be said. "Lucia, thank you for coming," Mato said, trying to keep his voice steady but failing to hide the pain in his words. "Why the mystery, Mato? You seem different," she replied, looking at him with concern. He took a deep breath, summoning the courage to continue. "I need to talk to you about something important, something that's been consuming me." Lucia leaned in slightly, as if trying to bridge the emotional distance she felt forming between them. "Go ahead. You know you can talk to me." Mato lowered his gaze, unable to look her in the eye. "Lucia, I can't do this anymore. Us, it's not right. It's not fair to you, to me, or to what I believe in." Her words hit Lucia like a blow. She blinked rapidly, trying to process what he was saying. "What do you mean, Mato? Are you ending everything?" "Yes," he replied, his voice breaking. "I have to end this. Not because I don't care about you, but because I care too much. This is destroying us. It's pulling me away from everything I am, and it's putting you in a position you don't deserve." "Do you think this is easy for me?" she asked, her voice now filled with emotion. "I trusted you, Mato. You were the only person who made me feel like I wasn't alone. And now you're just going to give up?" Mato felt the pain in her words but stood firm. "I never wanted to hurt you, Lucia. Never. But continuing this would be worse. I need to return to my faith, my integrity, and you deserve someone who can give you everything, not someone who lives torn between love and guilt." Lucia fell silent, her eyes brimming with tears. Deep down, she knew he was right, but that didn't make the words any less painful. "And what am I supposed to do now, Mato? What do I do without you?" "You're strong, Lucia, stronger than you think. I know you'll find your way, even without me. I'll always pray for you." The conversation ended there, leaving both of them engulfed in a mix of sadness and resignation. Lucia walked away from the garden without looking back, while Mato remained, feeling the cold of the night seep into his bones. He knew he had done what was right, but the guilt and longing wouldn't fade so easily. In the days that followed, Mato tried to focus on his duties as a priest. He redoubled his efforts at the church, attempting to reconnect with his faith and his community. But those around him still noticed his restlessness, the far-off gaze he often directed toward the horizon. Meanwhile, Lucia struggled to cope with her new reality. She felt betrayed, abandoned, yet she knew she had to move forward. However, the breakup would not be the end of their story, neither for her nor for Mato. What neither of them realized was that this decision, painful as it was only the beginning of a chain of events that would change their lives forever. The fatal confrontation. The night it all happened seemed no different from any other in Albuquerque. The wind whistled through the cobblestone streets, and the church of Santa Ines, illuminated by the flickering candles on the altar, stood in silent vigil at the heart of the town. But inside the rectory, the calm was only an illusion. A meeting, laden with the weight of recent decisions, was about to spiral into tragedy. Lucia entered through the side door, where Mato awaited her. He had left the office light on, as if the warm glow of the lamp could ease the inevitable tension of their conversation. Lucia was visibly agitated, her steps brisk and her face marked by a mix of anger and despair. Mato, seated behind his dark wooden desk, looked as weary as he was resolute. Why did you call me here, Mato? Lucia demanded, her voice sharp. After everything, what more do you have to say? He took a deep breath, placing his hands on the desk, trying to maintain his composure. I needed to see you to explain, to make it clear that my decision wasn't against you, Lucia. It was for both of us. I can't continue this. This? She repeated, her voice rising. You're calling what we had this? Everything we did, everything we shared, reduced to a cold, meaningless word? Mato stood slowly, trying to defuse the situation. Lucia, please try to understand. I lost myself in all of this. I let my feelings blind me, but I need to go back. Back to my faith, to my mission. Mission? She said with a bitter laugh. Your mission was to abandon me when I needed you most. You promised to stand by me, Mato. You promised. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the very space between them was charged with electricity. Lucia took a step forward, her eyes glistening with tears and anger. And what am I supposed to do now, huh? She continued. Do you think you can just erase everything that happened? That you can leave me alone, like everyone else did before you? I never wanted to hurt you, he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. But I can't walk this path anymore, Lucia. At that moment, something inside her seemed to snap. Lucia glanced around the room, as if searching for something to channel the storm of emotions consuming her. Her eyes settled on a heavy candlestick on the side table. Before Mato could react, she grabbed it with both hands, raising it above her head. Lucia, stop, Mato shouted, stepping back, but it was too late. With a single blow, the candlestick struck the side of Mato's head, sending him sprawling to the floor. He tried to get up, but he was disoriented, blood trickling down his temple. Lucia, still overcome with a mix of panic and rage, looked at the desk where a small letter opener rested. In her mind, the confusion gave way to a brutal urgency, an irrational desire to end the pain she felt. She picked up the object and, in an act that seemed beyond her control, drove it into Mato's chest. The muffled sound of metal piercing fabric and flesh echoed through the room, followed by Mato's pained gasp. He tried to speak, but the words failed him as his body collapsed heavily onto the cold floor. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Lucia stood there, motionless, the letter opener still trembling in her hand. Blood began to pool around Mato, forming a dark circle that reflected the yellowish glow of the office light. Lucia's face contorted into a mix of horror and disbelief. What had she done? She fell to her knees beside him, now sobbing, whispering, Mato, please don't leave me. I didn't mean to. But it was too late. His breathing grew irregular until it ceased entirely. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of the church bell tolling midnight. Lucia, now in shock, realized she couldn't stay there. She dropped the letter opener and ran out of the rectory, her hands still stained with blood. The cold night air struck her like a slap, but the reality of what had just occurred was far more brutal. Alburquerque, still enveloped in the tranquil sleep of its residents, was about to awaken to a scandal that would shake its foundations. And Lucia, who had once sought refuge in love, now became the central figure in a crime no one would ever forget. The discovery of the body. Dawn in Alburquerque arrived with a pale, silent sky, but the usual tranquility was about to be shattered in the most brutal way. Don Luis, the caretaker of the Church of Santa Ines, arrived at the building as he did every morning, carrying a ring of keys and an old lantern he used to inspect the still dark hallways. He had dedicated much of his life to the church, and for him, caring for the place was more than just a job, it was a calling. As he entered the rectory, something immediately felt off. The side door, which Mato always locked before going to bed, was slightly ajar. Don Luis frowned and pushed the door open, calling the priest's name with his raspy, deep voice. Father Mato, are you here? There was no answer. The dim light in the corridor revealed a heavy silence, almost tangible. He moved forward, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls. When he reached the office, the sight that greeted him froze him in place. There lay Mato, motionless on the cold floor. The dried blood around his body had formed a dark pool, and the letter opener lay nearby, a silent witness to what had occurred. Don Luis let out a cry that echoed through the church, a sound filled with all the pain and disbelief he felt. He dropped the lantern, which rolled away, casting a trembling light across the room. His hands shook as he tried to step closer, but the sight was so devastating that he couldn't take another step. The commotion spread quickly. The church bells, which should have heralded another ordinary day, tolled mournfully, as if the very soul of Albuquerque was in mourning. The still sleepy residents stepped out into the streets, drawn by Don Luis's cries and the unmistakable sound of tragedy. "It's Father Mato!" someone shouted, and those words cut through the air like a blade. Within minutes, the square in front of the church was filled with a crowd, each face marked by a mixture of shock and sorrow. Some wept openly, others remained silent, struggling to process what seemed impossible. The local police were called, but in such a small town, resources were limited. Martin Delgado, the head of the precinct, arrived with 2 deputies, both clearly uncomfortable with the gravity of the situation. Martin, an experienced man, seemed shaken himself as he entered the rectory and saw Mato's body. "May God help us," he murmured, making the sign of the cross before beginning his inspection. The crime scene revealed more than it seemed at first glance. The heavy candlestick, stained with dried blood, was out of place, silently screaming of the violence that had occurred. The bloodied letter opener near the body became a key piece of evidence. But it was the lack of signs of forced entry or prolonged struggle that deepened the mystery. It was as if the perpetrator had entered and exited without much resistance, raising even more questions. Meanwhile, the residents of Albuquerque delved into speculation. Who could do something so horrible, they asked each other. To many, Mato had been the epitome of kindness and virtue, someone who had never made enemies. But for others, his recent change in behavior began to take on a new light. "He'd been acting different these past months," commented Doña Carmen, dabbing her tears with a handkerchief. "Do you think that had something to do with it?" Theories began to surface: a robbery gone wrong, an act of revenge, or perhaps something connected to secrets Mato might have been hiding. Each resident seemed to have a theory, yet none made complete sense. Lucia, meanwhile, watched the chaos unfold from afar. Hiding in her small room on the outskirts of town, she could hear the bells and the whispers spreading through the streets. Her heart pounded so hard it echoed in her ears. She knew what she had done, but she still couldn't believe she had reached this point. The bloodstains on her hands had been washed away, but the weight of her guilt clung to her like a second skin. The discovery of Mato's body plunged Albuquerque into a state of collective mourning, but it also opened the door to an investigation that would uncover secrets the town never imagined. The once united community, built on faith and tranquility, now found itself divided between grief and a desperate search for answers. And at the center of it all was the mystery of who had taken Father Mato's life, a question whose unraveling was just beginning. The start of the investigation. The investigation into the death of Father Mato Alvarez began the following morning, as Albuquerque was still reeling from the devastating news. The small rectory office, now cordoned off with warning tape, had become the epicenter of a mystery that promised to shake the town to its core. Chief of Police Martin Delgado, a meticulous and serious man known for his dedication to truth, seemed burdened by the weight of this case. The murder of the priest was not just a crime, it was a desecration for the deeply religious community. "Nothing can be overlooked here," Martin told his team as they began collecting evidence. "The entire town will expect swift answers, and we must deliver them." The crime scene revealed more than met the eye. The heavy candlestick, stained with dried blood, was out of place, a silent scream of the violence that had occurred. Near the body, the blood-streaked letter opener became a key piece of evidence. But it was during a thorough search of the office that the police discovered something that shifted the direction of the investigation. Among the documents on Father Mato's desk was a locked drawer. When opened, it revealed a small bundle of letters tied with a simple cord. The letters, written on cheap paper, showed signs of frequent handling, as if Mato had read and reread each one. However, it was their contents that caught Martin and his team's attention. "Dear Mato, you are the only light in my life. I know our love is forbidden, but I cannot help it. Thank you for everything you do for me. One day, I hope we can live free of this burden." These words, among others, were signed by Lucia Morales, The passionate and desperate tone of the messages began to paint a clear picture for investigators. Mato and Lucia had shared a relationship that far exceeded the boundaries accepted by the community, and certainly the priesthood. "So, that's it," one officer said, carefully placing the letters into an evidence bag. "A forbidden romance. That explains a lot." Martine wasn't entirely convinced. "It explains some things, but not everything. We still need solid evidence connecting Lucia to this." The discovery quickly fueled rumors throughout the town. Albuquerque, already submerged in shock and mourning, became a cauldron of speculation. The townspeople, who had once revered Mato, were now split between disbelief and judgment. Father Mato? Involved with a woman? And an immigrant, no less? People whispered in markets and squares. Some tried to defend his memory. "We're all human," said Doña Carmen, her eyes welling with tears. "If he loved someone, it doesn't erase all the good he did for us." Others were less forgiving. "If this is true, he wasn't the man we thought he was," a man remarked at the local cafe. As the rumors spread, the police pressed forward with their investigation. Lucia, meanwhile, was unaware that the letters had been discovered. She remained in hiding, avoiding the streets and grappling with the guilt that consumed her. Yet her absence began to draw attention. Friends and acquaintances noticed her absence from her usual haunts, and her silence spoke louder than words. Martine knew Lucia needed to be questioned. At the very least, she's a person of interest. If these letters are genuine, she knew more about Father Mato than anyone else in town. When officers arrived at the house where Lucia lived, she was nowhere to be found. Her small room appeared hastily abandoned. Signs of her rushed departure were everywhere. Clothes draped over a chair, an open suitcase, and a half-empty glass of water on the bedside table. The only notable item was a torn piece of paper on the floor, bearing a single word: "Sorry." Lucia's flight only deepened the suspicions. To many, it was a clear sign of guilt. But to Martine, it also posed a challenge. He knew he had to find her, not just for answers, but to uncover the full truth of what had happened that fateful night. As the investigation progressed, the mystery of the forbidden romance and the act of violence that followed cast a long shadow over Albert, transforming mourning into distrust. And as long as Lucia remained missing, one question lingered in everyone's mind. What truly happened between Lucia Morales and Father Mato Alvarez? The revelation of Lucia. The revelation that Lucia Morales was the woman involved with Father Mato Alvarez struck the quiet town of Albuquerque like a bombshell. The connection, once just a rumor, was confirmed by the letters found in the rectory and testimonies from residents who began recalling details they had previously dismissed as insignificant. "She was always at the church, always near the priest," remarked Doña Carmen, who had once defended Mato but was now visibly shaken. The news spread quickly, not only in Albuquerque but also in neighboring communities. A respected priest involved in a romance with a young immigrant woman and murdered so brutally, it was a story no one could ignore. The townsfolk, torn between grief and indignation, began questioning everything they thought they knew about Mato. To some, he was a tragic victim of his emotions. To others, a man who betrayed his faith and his community. Meanwhile, Lucia, now located in a nearby town, was arrested and brought back to Albuquerque for questioning. Her face, once unknown to most, was now the center of attention. As the police escorted her to the station, she kept her head low but could not escape the judgmental stares and whispered words of the townsfolk gathered in the square. "She destroyed everything," one woman said. "Not just the priest's life, but the peace of our town." Shaped Lucia's trial. Lucia Morales' trial began weeks later, transforming the small town of Albuquerque into a stage for tension and debate. The local courthouse, usually reserved for minor cases, was packed with curious onlookers, journalists, and residents eager for answers. Lucia, thin and visibly worn, entered the courtroom flanked by 2 guards. Her lawyer, a young and inexperienced man, looked as nervous as she did. The prosecution, however, was determined to prove that the murder of Father Mato was a premeditated act born of resentment and rejection. During the trial, Lucia recounted her version of the events. Her voice, trembling at first, grew stronger as she spoke. She described her bond with Mato, the support he had offered her, and how their relationship had evolved into something more intimate. She did not deny the act, but justified it as the result of unbearable desperation. "He was my only hope," she said, tears streaming down her face. "When he abandoned me, I felt like I had nothing left." The prosecution, however, presented damning evidence: the letters, the history of arguments between the two, and the objects used in the crime. The candlestick and the letter opener became symbols of a brutal act that, according to them, could not be justified by any emotion. Lucia's words were interpreted in different ways. Some saw her as a broken woman pushed to her limits by terrible circumstances. Others viewed her as manipulative, using her status as a victim to justify an unforgivable act. She knew exactly what she was doing, the prosecutor declared in his closing statement. This was a premeditated crime, a calculated act of vengeance, not desperation. Shape, the final sentence. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally returned with its verdict. Lucia Morales was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The sentence elicited mixed reactions in Alburquerque. For some, it was a relief, a sense of justice restored for Father Mato and his memory. For others, it felt like an excessive punishment for a woman who had already endured so much. "She deserves to pay for what she did," said an older resident. "But I can't help but feel that everyone lost here." As Lucia was led out of the courtroom, she took one last look at the town where everything had happened. Her tears mingled with an expression of resignation, as though she had finally accepted the weight of her actions and the fate that awaited her. The death of Father Mato and Lucia's trial left deep scars on Alburquerque. The Church of Santa Ynez, once a symbol of faith and unity, became a silent reminder of secrets, tragedies, and human failings. And for the townspeople, the story of Mato and Lucia was not just a scandal, but a somber reflection of life's complexities, faith, and the choices that can destroy even the purest of souls. The legacy of tragedy. The Church of Santa Ynez, once the spiritual heart of Alburquerque, never regained its former glory after the tragic events involving Father Mato and Lucia Morales. Once a place of peace and unity, it became a somber symbol of betrayal, sin, and suffering. With every toll of the bell, the townspeople were reminded of the night trust was shattered and the town's innocence was forever stained. Attendance at Mass dropped drastically. Many faithful, unable to separate the memory of the crime from the image of the church, chose to pray at home or in neighboring villages. The empty pews and stained glass windows, which once reflected hope, now seemed to tell a story of pain and disillusionment. Even Don Luis, the devoted caretaker, decided to retire, unable to continue tending to a place so deeply scarred by tragedy. Among Alburquerque's residents, the case left profound wounds. Friends who once supported one another began to harbor doubts. Conversations in the square, once lively, now revolved around theories and suspicions. Did someone know and say nothing? Was a frequent question, reflecting a collective sense of failure. Despite the passage of time, the shadow of the scandal continued to hang over the town. For many, the tragedy was a bitter lesson about the dangers of silence and secrets. For others, it was a painful reminder that even the holiest places can harbor complex and destructive human dramas. Santa Ynez remains in the center of Alburquerque, but not as it once was. Now it is seen as a monument to human fragility, a place where the sacred and the profane collided in a devastating way, leaving a legacy the town would never forget. Shape, what did you think of this story? Have you ever heard of such an intense and twist-filled case like this one? Share your thoughts in the comments about the choices and challenges the characters faced. Have you ever experienced something similar, or do you know someone who has faced such a profound dilemma? Share your story. I'll reply in the comments. Your participation might help spark even more reflections about this ending. And if you haven't already, make sure to grab your copy of the book I've left for you in the pinned comment. I've also put together an incredible playlist with videos of cases similar to this one to help you recognize and understand the signs and criminal behaviors that often go unnoticed. In addition to the playlist, I'm sharing a special case where the unexpected ending reveals a behavioral pattern that could change how you view these situations. Don't miss this opportunity to learn and protect yourself. Stay safe and always be vigilant. See you in the next video.